Am I almost? Hello! Hello! Hi everyone! Okay, I am streaming on Facebook and Instagram. Great. This is very, very exciting. I fixed all the technical difficulties from last week, which is really exciting. I'm streaming this in a higher quality of video as well, and which will be great for people who want to come back and watch this later on. This is episode 4. I hope you enjoyed the last 3, and I'm going to continue doing these through till we get to 5. Like 10 or more episodes. I think would be really fun. So this week, just going to go straight into it today. This week I have another reading that I'm going to do from Luca Turin's and Tanya Sanchez's Perfume's The Guide, which is a fantastic book. And as I said in the first or second episode, is the first book that I ever bought about perfume with my own money. And it sort of started the whole perfume craze for me a few years ago. And so I'm going to jump straight into that reading. And I hope you like this little section. I was just reading this this part from this book, honestly, a few minutes before we started on the video, and so I've only actually this is the first time I've reread this in half a decade, but I thought it really captured something interesting and quite special about perfume and about the way people create feelings and express extraordinary things through the proper alignment of simple materials in perfume. And so I'm going to start, it's only about a page, I'm going to start from here. Okay. What we're really talking about is the art of abstraction in perfumery, the creation of a new smell for its own qualities, and not for any fidelity to things already known. How is it done? Magic. For example, a smart, funny, wonderful woman I once knew wondered, referring to the great long discontinued Iris Gris created by Jacques Faith. Why the smells of iris and peach, in some mysterious proportion, create a third, haunting smell that is neither iris nor peach, but something entirely new. She apologized for not understanding the science of it. It wasn't science, but art. Though both rely heavily upon a combination of inspiration and happy accident. To illustrate the elegant simplicity of this particular idea, one night, while I was doing my best to help a friend drain some bottles that might be useful if they weren't so full of wine, this friend, an amateur perfumer, toiling for love, not money, following a previous suggestion of Luca's, took some persicol. So just for some context, persicol, at least in this context, is a peach-smelling base used in perfume. I'm pretty sure it just contains, I'm imagining it contains the largest proportion of it would be something called peach lactone, which has that really incredibly intense sort of fuzzy peach smell that is really, really beautiful and very important to a number of iconic perfumes. And mixed persicol, drop by drop, into a small vial of the closest thing on hand to iris butter, tincture, which is oil of iris, which I'll show you later on. Sergei Lutin's, I guess that's how you say it, Sergei Lutin's wonderful iris silver mist. Magic is always most astonishing when done small and up close. For a while we smelt only iris, then for a time both iris and peach. We were on the verge of something. We were on the verge of getting bored with our game when one last drop pushed the mixture into the realm of the inexplicable. Instead of the iris and peach keeping their separate identities, we perceived billowing out of the vial a third presence, like a newborn dream object with the satin cool of its rooty father, and a plummy richness inherited from its lactonic mother. It was iris gris in the rough. The idea itself is simple enough once you know it's there, but finding and recognizing it is not so easy. You can no more predict the next great, beautiful perfumery idea than you can predict the next catchy melody before you hear it. Now, you may think perfumery is pretty easy if so much relies on happy accidents. But 3 things need to be in place for a happy accident to become worthwhile. Someone must be obsessed and daring enough to tinker and generate the new ideas. Someone must be able to spot the good one among the host of useless ones, and someone needs to be able to have the skill to realize the idea's full potential. The breathless claims of fragrance marketing to the contrary, it is just not true that fine ingredients guarantee a great perfume. Imagine chucking a fresh Maine lobster, a wheel of top-notch camembert, and a pound of artisan Ecuadorian chocolate into a kettle and simmering it until Wednesday. Yummy? It doesn't work like that for perfume either. It generally takes years of training to become a perfumer, and even a talented perfumer needs to work with evaluators and clients who can recognize a good idea when they smell one. So that's just that little section from, again, from Perfume's The Guide by Luca Turin and Tanya Sanchez. I thought it was a really cool way of starting this talk for today, and there are some really beautiful and interesting ideas. I hope you liked that little passage. I've tried to pick passages that are still really useful for beginners and for people who are just interested in trying to get connected with the world of scent, which is something I'm really passionate about. And something that sort of runs through that passage when I was reading it before the talk today is that is the amount of patience it takes to create a perfume, and the amount of curiosity and openness it takes. I think an idea I had a little while ago about the real sort of creative guts of perfume is this idea of the sort of symbol of the phoenix. I love symbols and their ancient meanings, and as everyone knows, the phoenix, once it gets to a certain age, well, everyone knows the phoenix is a mythological bird. It's actually based on a Egyptian. The phoenix is a Greek name for the bird, which is based on an earlier Egyptian idea called the Bennu, which is very interesting because I have a perfume called Bennu. And anyhow, the phoenix is a mythological bird that once it reaches a certain age, it sort of bursts into ash and it hatches itself again. If anyone's seen Harry Potter, I think there's a fantastic scene of it in one of the first Harry Potter movies. And in Perfume, we do something kind of similar where we're maybe trying to, for example, create maybe the smell of a particular time of day in a particular place, and we're coming back to that idea with a small number of materials. At least in my work, it's a small number of materials because I'm trying to initiate this kind of like maximal minimalist movement, and or trying to be a part of that movement at least. And we'll come back to this idea of trying to create and manifest these ideas in scent. And we'll make drafts after drafts and versions and trials after, I know, sort of, sometimes we'll make hundreds of different variations, and sometimes they'll be very different, and sometimes they'll be minuscule sort of changes. Maybe you'll change something by the tiniest little increment, and it's from those trials that we create that we pick one particular version that goes into the final perfume. And it's from the ashes of the unsuccessful ideas that we create in our perfumes, that the new life of the fragrance itself comes up out of the ground. And that's a sort of a beautiful way of understanding this regenerative process that is perfume, and that is used sort of when you're trying to create things that you don't yet fully understand. Because a lot of the time I will create things like, a couple of years ago I worked on the smell of ripe fig. I haven't eaten a ripe fig for probably 6 years. So I was going off a kind of imaginary subconscious sort of feeling for a lot of it. And so I thought I would mention that. And now we're going to do the smell and tell. So for today's talk, last week we started with cis-3-hexanol. So every talk I bring in a scent material that we use in perfume. And last week I brought in cis-3-hexanol, which is sort of, as I sort of explained, is that cut grass scent with, but it sort of can dive into that smell of sort of budding leaves, and the smell of new sort of new gardenia buds, and it's also in a lot of fruit. You need to use it to create a lot of fruit scents. So today's smell and tell is this little fellow. It's called Orris Tincture. You guys can probably see the color here. It's very dark, kind of. It's sort of like an incredibly dark, like vermilion kind of maroon color, almost blood red. It's so it comes from the iris root. I think quite a few people are familiar with iris as a ingredient in perfume. What tends to happen with iris is they harvest the roots of the plant, the rhizomes, and then they sweat them in an underground sort of cabin for 3 to 5 years, and so that the scent gets really, really intense. And then from there they will either solvent extract it, or they'll create a tincture out of it, which is what this is. This was the first material I ever smelt from the iris plant, because you can get a number of different variations of this. You can get a concrete, or what's called a butter, which is sort of, I think, more used in perfume, or you can get the tincture. And the reason why I have picked this ingredient today is because this will relate to the perfume that we will be talking about in this talk, which is Winstons. And I thought that, partly because of the time of the year and the season that it is here in Canberra, I thought it would be nice to talk about Winstons, because it's a really, really good kind of smouldering, robust perfume that relates a lot to cold weather for me. And so, without further ado, I'm going to smell this and talk about it when it's on the strip. So I've just got these little scent strips that I use every day, and I'm going to give this fellow a smell. So this is a 10% tincture. Tinctures just are essentially like tea a bit. You literally just get the raw material that you're trying to capture the scent of, and you usually have to dry it for a period of time, and then you probably powder it and with like a mortar and pestle kind of thing, brick and mortar and pestle. Yeah, that's the thing it's called. And from there, you just steep it in very pure alcohol and let it mature over time. So this material is from France. It's from French iris rhizomes. Yeah, it's just stunning. It's really, it's very beautiful. It smells a lot like sweet earth, and it has a lot of accents that kind of lean into that violet flower element, but a lot darker and a little rougher, like a sort of like a violet from the streets kind of thing. Um, it has this beautiful, dry, almost sort of aged tobacco element as well. It's incredibly dark. It's one of my favorite materials, and it plays a really big part in Winstons. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that works in. But anyway, today's smell and tell is the iris rhizome tincture, and it's quite a unique ingredient because it has both a real earthiness and a sweetness at the same time. And to me, I've tried to. I remember quite a long time ago using it to evoke the smell of a dirt path in the middle of winter, and where the sun kind of comes and hits the dirt. Uh, yeah, it's quite a lovely ingredient, and it's very special to me. I've used it for about as long as I've used any other material in my life, and it is quite interesting, and you can use it for both sort of to accompany a really masculine, dry, intense scents like Winston's is, or you can use it for the more light and floral and kind of like abstract florals that tend to be more apparent in some feminine perfumes. Yeah, and it also has a little bit of like a ripening hay kind of idea going into Bronia flower with that sort of, again, with that violety sweetness. It's so interesting. Most iris materials, even if they're synthetics, which we can talk about next week maybe, they will connect with the smell of violet, even though they're very different and look very different. They're closely related enough that you kind of get this crossover between the two, which is kind of why irises and iris materials in perfume tend to be used a lot to get violet flowers, because violet flower oil doesn't really exist, at least to my knowledge. I think it used to be created hundreds of years ago, and it cost about $800,000 a kilo when it exists. The violet leaf does exist as an extracted perfume. It's still very expensive, but it's quite common. Anyway, that is our smell of the day. Quite a lovely fellow, this iris tincture. So from there, I thought it would be really interesting to play a section of Winstons. I'm not really sure what the audio capacity of live streaming is with playing music off the computer. I'm sure it would be fine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a section of Winstons, just to set the context a little bit. Winstons is a perfume that I created at the end of 2016. It was one of the first perfumes I created when I came back from Bangkok, where I studied at Perfumers World. Shout out to Perfume World and all those guys there. And it was a really interesting experience because I have based this perfume on a song. So I started with no idea of how it would turn out, and I started with no materials and no ingredients. I just started with this song. Um, I had previously to that created a perfume called Especial, which we'll talk about potentially next week, see how we go. And in that perfume, that was the first time I'd really taken a whole song and created kind of I guess, a fully blossomed composition around a song. And so I'm going to play a little bit of Winstons now. I'll leave the link where you can listen to the song probably in the comments. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, here we go. So I've just linked that in the comments there to the song that Winstons is based on. And I'm going to play the opening 30 seconds or so. So feel free to just listen on to Winstons. That should do, I think. So what I've just done whilst that was playing is I just, in the comments here, have posted my official online description of Winstons for the perfume. So you can go to that as well, and you can read that whole thing, because that's quite a lovely 200 or 300 word intro to the perfume that I wrote back then. So that was Winstons, and I'm going to now run through how that relates to Winstons as the perfume. And I'm going to talk about, first off, the heart note of the perfume, as we spoke about, I think, last week, where I talked about the heart note, the sort of secondary heart note, the top note, and the base notes of a perfume as a structural thing, meaning that perfumes have a structure like a building does, or like a song does, which is a convenient kind of connection there. So the voice that you heard there, which is a sort of quite a rough, like, male vocal. The song as a whole is kind of about Winstons, which is a cigarette brand, which I think still exists, and about trying to quit smoking and about smoking in general. I don't smoke, so there are certain sort of interesting connections there that I had to make up. But the heart note of the fragrance is quite interesting, because I've tried to... I remember thinking that the vocal itself had this kind of beautiful, like, somber, melancholy energy to it, but at the same time it had a great deal of intimacy. I was very close, and the way he's mic'd up is right up to the microphone. And so I ended up having this interesting idea of how the vocal of that song really promoted this idea of cold and warm at the same time, kind of like a beautiful tension within the vocal just by itself. And so I created this idea around ginger oil, just plain ginger oil, with cardamom oil, nutmeg, and then I believe a material called coumarin, which has a kind of marzipan with with sort of sun-bathed hay sort of smell. And then I also, so those are sorts of like just in the heart note, that's sort of the warm qualities. So a lot of those things like ginger and nutmeg, these things have a kind of incredible, vivid warmth. They tend to trigger what's called, I think it's called the trimeneal like glands, which are like here on everyone, which tend to they're responsible for our response to hot and cold smells. So and it's important to realize when I'm explaining a lot of this, every smell, more or less, I guess, has its relationship to temperature. So you have warm smells like spices, cold smells like mint and eucalyptus, and they relate to this gland that is sort of at the sides of our noses here. And anyway, in the heart note of Winstons, so you have this hot, spicy element that I then contrasted with juniper berry, which is responsible traditionally for the taste of gin, and a kind of eucalyptus that's only found in sort of, I guess, mid-coastal Western Australia called Eucalyptus kochi or Eucalyptus mali. It has two different names. It's a particularly cool kind of eucalyptus because it doesn't have the mentholic freezing mint element. It's far more like that typical gum nut kind of scent, which is not really what we think about when we think about eucalyptus. We think about it more as like a Vicks Vapor Rub deep heat kind of scent. So that's really interesting. So just in the heart note, we have this warm spice, nutmeg, ginger oil idea mixed with this very, very cold eucalyptus juniper berry idea. And it's brought together in the heart note, and that creates the kind of edginess and tension in the perfume itself. And it's very, very much responsible for the texture, which is very rough and kind of almost like granular. It's really a significant part of the perfume. Everything else sort of is the setting for that heart note in the perfume, really. So moving from the heart note, we have, and again, I'm doing this sort of like the scent, the music, how they come together, how I build like a musical perfume formula. From there, we have the top note, which in the song, if you listen back to it briefly, there is there's a hi-hat, that little sound. There is a very short snare, making that like sound, and then there is, every now and then, there's a cymbal, which is again just a kind of a mix between the two. Those are sort of the highest, cleanest, clearest bits of the song to me. And so for that part of the perfume, I added, it's so interesting because just as a side note to this, what I was thinking about before this talk was about how the phonetics of words, so phonetics just meaning the aesthetic sound of certain words, I suppose. I'm sure there's a different definition of it, but that's the definition I'm using. How those relate to kind of like the kinesthetic and the emotional feelings of the words themselves, just the sounds of the words. For some reason, sort of bringing it back to Winstons, for some reason, for this section that is supposed to evoke, interpret the hi-hats and this particular kind of percussion in the song, the word quench kept coming to mind. I'm not sure why. It has nothing to do with thirst. It has nothing to do with anything that really relates to the word quench. But it's something to do with the word, the way it starts with the Q and ends with the CH, and how those together seem to somehow provoke the symbolic, like, texture that I needed to work on for this part of the scent. I hope that makes sense. It's sort of an abstraction on what I was hearing to then be able to make up that gap in between the song and the scent. So I used plain lemon oil, which can never be underestimated, despite how sort of it's kind of gone out of fashion in perfume. Um, Plain lemon oil with this tangerine oil that I really, really love, that's quite hard to find, with orange flower oil, so just the flowers from the bitter orange tree, and I believe that's all from what I can remember. Again, I don't have a formula in front of me, so I'm just going off the top of my mind of what I put into this perfume. And I made Winstons nearly 5 years ago, so it's somewhat hard to remember. But that gave the perfume a kind of insane, bright, kind of soft metallicness. That sounds worse than it is. It's just that kind of that feeling of light and crispness that we get with when you hear a lot of those sounds in music. So that's the top note. So you have that heart note together with what I said before, mixed with the mixed with that light citrusy idea. And so moving on, the other part of the perfume. So there's two more parts. One is the female vocal that is sort of looped around in the song. I think it could be something that something that the musician has sampled and looped over, so you just get this kind of record player female voice kind of tone, which is one of my favorite bits of the song. Again, listen back to it if you need to clarify which bit I'm talking about. But there's this little female vocal in the song, which has this beautiful sort of smooth distance to it to me, and a kind of it gives in a way, to talk about this with a metaphor, it gives the perfume, or gives the song, a much needed sense of like sort of feminine smoothness. It finishes the perfume with that kind of feeling, finishes the song with that kind of feeling. And so for that section I used this material, which we talked about a little earlier, the iris tincture, or orris tincture. And then I used a material called alpha ionone, which is the main ingredient. It's like the main chemical component responsible for the smell of violets. And then I mix that with, I believe, a synthetic jasmine material called hedione, which is one of my favorite materials, and sort of smells like what I think halogen light would smell like. I've used it to evoke light and a sense of lift, a sense of flight, maybe, in a perfume. And from there, so that gives the perfume this kind of dramatic purple sweetness, essentially. It's quite interesting because as a batch of Winstons, because I make all the perfumes that I create in batches, and then I siphon those off into the bottles. Although recently I've been doing bottle to bottle rather than batch. But anyway, as a batch of Winston matures, that violety sweet kind of floral element comes through more and more, and so it ends up becoming sort of starting at a really rustic masculine perfume and changing into a feminine perfume as it ages, which is really interesting. And so something that tends to be done as a perfume technique, which I didn't realize at the time of creating this, creating Winstons, is this combination of woody, spicy, dry, sort of intense, harsh, earthy notes with sweeter, violety um, yeah, violet-like notes and contrasting those together. It tends to be a way of creating certain perfumes with the correct kind of like affinity and sort of tension, which is really interesting. And I kind of just fell into that as the idea unfolded without realizing that that was a thing that people actually did. Just sort of interesting. I like how that happens rather than being like, okay, there's this kind of perfume called a chypre, and it involves moss and jasmine and blah blah blah. I'm much more about what materials do I need? How do I need to put them together based on what I'm trying to evoke at this point in time on Earth in this room? It's a bit more different than saying fruity floral coming right up. So with that in mind, then we go to the bass note of the perfume, which is the drums. So in that song, there is a kick drum. Most people are pretty familiar with the kick drum. It's that low, thuddy, punchy sound in the drums. And then also in this section of the perfume is the sub bass, the bass, the low end frequencies of the song. So I used quite a lot in this section of the perfume because it was very hard for me at the time to create enough grounding and to place the rest of the perfume that I had created in this kind of frame of depth and with enough darkness as well. It was quite difficult when you end up with a perfume that has a lot of contrasting parts to it and potentially has a lot of different moving parts, quite a large number of ingredients. You end up needing to be very careful how you bring the perfume together because it tends to either fail or fly when you put those bits together. It's a little it's a little different when the perfume is somewhat more simple in like in a minimalist sense. But so in this drums section, in the bass note of the perfume, you have this idea of a Virginian cedarwood, which is a very dear sort of smell to me. Maybe I can use it as a smell and tell for one of the future videos. It has that beautiful smell of kind of very old wood and furniture and of like lacquered window sills and that kind of thing. To me, it's probably the best of the cedarwood oils, and there's a lot of different ones, but it's got that classic kind of wood scent that I associate with a lot of warmth and a lot of vibrancy, and it tells a big story. And so I've brought that together with tobacco absolute, which is an amazingly interesting ingredient. It's people, from what I can tell, because Winstons has been available to the public now for as long as anything I've ever created, I have a lot of feedback from it, which is quite nice. And I think some people get freaked out by the tobacco, but they do it because they associate the tobacco with cigarettes, when in reality, tobacco, when you smell it as a raw material and as an ingredient in perfume, you get all of these beautiful nuances of green and that leafy, these beautiful leafy elements, sort of like like tobacco fresh off, fresh from the ground kind of thing. It's a very different experience to smell that. As opposed to smell a cigarette, I suppose. And so I've combined those two together with a material called Cephalus, I believe it's called, which has that old leathery. I kind of associate that scent with the smell of like leather booths and leather seats at really old nightclubs and that kind of thing. It's a very interesting scent, Then with a few different sort of, so those are the three main ones in that section of the perfume. Then it's sort of, I've brought in accents of some different resins, um, a synthetic version of a material called civet, which is sort of a story in itself. But civet is a material that used to be used in traditional perfume, sort of, I guess, ending at the start of the 1900s. It's from an Ethiopian cat. Um, I don't use any of the real stuff. In modern perfume, we have synthetic variations and versions of it. So there's a bit of that in Winstons, and it has a really interesting, dirty kind of scent, musky, dirty scent. Then I believe all there is a couple of different musk elements that I gave it to sort of smoothen and soften the harshness of the tobacco and the cedarwood, which are really edgy ingredients. They have a lot of tension in them. So that's the layout of Winston's in a really roundabout way. I think it's an extraordinarily interesting perfume because there's lots to discover. It gives a lot when you wear it and when you spray it. It travels really interestingly in the air as well. When I was creating Winston's, I made a few versions of it at like 30% concentrate, which is sort of like a eau de perfume, or what's called an eau de extract concentrate in perfume, and Winston's was almost completely unwearable. So it's been diluted back down to about 8%, which is like an eau de toilette concentration. So you get, which is just perfect for Winston. So you get all these different sort of roller coaster of ideas in the perfume without it being too much. It sort of gives you enough to wake you up, but it sort of edges away in the right parts to me. So that is Winston's. I'm really glad to be able to talk about that. As I said before, the song that Winston's is based on, which is really a really important bit of the process. It's sort of all of my perfumes are heavily based on story, and the process is the product in a lot of ways, and I think that's really important and pivotal for sort of thinking about scent in general, really. It's not just this bottled thing. It has a lots of myths and stories and narratives wrapped into it, which are as much a part of it as anything else to me. And I've also linked that the URL for Winston's official write-up, so you can read about that, which describes the whole scent. And I have new batches of Winston's as well available now, so it's now available for its largest 30ml size like this fellow, and the small ones, which is great because I hadn't made a batch in like 2 years because it was maturing so well. And if there are any questions, you can leave them below, or feel free to just comment as you've watched this in the future and you'd like to leave a comment. If I could ask anyone who has any of my perfumes and would like to leave a review on my Etsy, my online Etsy, feel free to do that. That would be so cool. I have, I think, 5 to 10 reviews on there now, which is great because my Etsy's not, I don't think my Etsy's about 10 months old, still very new. So a review would be lovely, and feel free to tell your friends about these videos as well. I will see you next week at the same time, 4 o'clock every Sunday, and I can't wait for next week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!